Hi, everybody. This is the Hungry Math Professor here. Thank you for coming to my channel. And today we're going to discuss Web of Belief by Willard Quine and Joe Ullian. And this book was published in 1970, the first edition. And it comes out of a very famous paper by Quine that was published in 1951 entitled Two Dogmas of Empiricism. So you can read that paper as well. In this paper, Quine mostly critiques Kant's distinction between analytic and synthetic, and partly because this distinction was picked up by Rudolf Carnap, a contemporary philosopher of Quine, though slightly older than Quine. Um, and so most of the paper is taking up this distinction and just showing from Quine's point of view why this distinction is not useful and not a good distinction. But at the very end of the paper, what's interesting is that Quine introduces this idea of a web of belief, right, after sort of going through all this analysis, kind of beating up on Rudolf Carnap's point of view. That being said, so Quine's dissertation advisor was Alfred North Whitehead, this famous person who's known in particular for his work with Bertrand Russell on the Principia Mathematica. But Alfred North Whitehead also did a lot more after that. And but Quine, sort of after having this research leave after his dissertation, meets Carnap and calls Carnap also like a big teacher of Quine. So both Quine and Carnap, I think, have a lot of respect for each other, but they come to disagree, and Quine comes to disagree with Carnap's project. And so again, a lot of the paper is just, um, this guy Quine is really respects Rudolf Carnap and considers him a great teacher, but they disagree fundamentally on some particular issues here. But again, at the very end of the paper, Quine, um, comes down from this analysis, of this critique, and then introduces what he thinks is the right way to approach things. And that's when he introduces this web of belief, which is a very sort of pragmatic way of thinking about beliefs that we have and how they're interconnected. And this web, is supposed to be a good metaphor here, where on the very interior of the web maybe is logic, right? And for Quine, everything is revisable, but perhaps logic is somehow in the core and less likely to be revised. And then maybe next to that is mathematics and like very established science. And as you go out in the web, you get like maybe more cutting edge science, things that haven't been around for so long. And then you get like political beliefs and beliefs about history and just beliefs about your community or whatever. These beliefs out here that are in the web that are like very much expected to be revised, right? Like maybe we meet someone and we think that they're not a very honest person, but then we get more information about them, we revise our beliefs about that person, or maybe we have some beliefs about um, some political leaders, but then we get some more information. Like these are the kinds of beliefs we expect to revise like on a very everyday basis. But for Quine, this web of belief is completely revisable at different stages, depending on the kind of evidence that comes in and that requires us to sort of revise our webs. And so this was introduced again in 1951 in this paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. But then the book that I'm discussing today is Web of Belief, came out in 1970, and he sort of expounds on his ideas and makes them much more detailed and careful in this book with Joe Ullian. And it's very well written. It's very readable, probably the most readable philosophy book I've ever read at this point. The book, in the preface, they mentioned that the book was commissioned for inclusion in a freshman English course, which is a surprising thing when after reading this book. But apparently, it mainly wound up in introductory philosophy courses. Now, that's not surprising to me at all after reading this book. It does seem to be most appropriate for introductory philosophy courses or other philosophy courses, though perhaps it would have been nice to have in English courses. I don't know. Let me read a quote from page 4 that I think really captures some of what their goals here were with writing this book. So this is from the introduction chapter. But even as light is opposed by darkness, science and reason have their enemies. Superstition and belief in magic are as old as man himself. For the intransigence of facts and our limitations in controlling them can be powerfully hard to take. Add to this the reflection that we are in an age when it is popular to distrust whatever is seen as the established view or the establishment. And it is no wonder that anti rational attitudes and doctrines are mustering so much support. It's interesting to read that paragraph given how much that is true today in 2024. Continuing this, still, we can understand what encourages the anti rationalist turn without losing our zeal for opposing it. A current continuing education catalog offers a course description under the heading Philosophy that typifies the dark view at its darkest. This is a quote from that philosophy course. Children of science that we are, we have based our cultural pattern on logic, on the cognitive, on the verifiable. But more and more there has crept into current research and study the haunting suggestion that there are other kinds of knowledge unfathomable by our cognition, other ways of knowing beyond the limits of our logic, which are deserving of our serious attention. Now, knowledge unfathomable by our cognition is simply incoherent, as attention to the words makes clear. Moreover, all that creeps in is not gold. One wonders how many students enroll. So, Quine and Joe's point here is that people love to talk about like these other ways of coming to knowledge beyond logic and rationality. And I've also encouraged people that you encounter people that love to talk about that. And it's Quine and Joe's job here to kind of elucidate how that's just there isn't anything beyond rationality and logic. It doesn't mean that rationality and logic are completely foolproof or give us certainty, but those are sort of the only ways to come to any kind of reasonable knowledge is sort of what this book represents. And also, I am certainly in agreement with that. So this is a book about epistemology, right? In philosophy, it's about how do we know what we know. That's what epistemology tries to study. How do we come to truth, knowledge, and beliefs? And early on in the book, the authors make a distinction between truth, knowledge, and beliefs, right? Truth is what we're all after in some sense when we read philosophy texts or read science, or but we're looking for truth, right? And most of us are out there thinking and trying to understand what the truth is. But truth is hard to come by. At least it's hard to come by with absolute certainty attached to it, right? And so knowledge is when we have justified true belief. Think about like if you had a math test and if you get the right answer, but you can't justify why that's the answer you gave, then oftentimes you won't get credit in a math course, including my math courses. So knowledge is justified true belief. It's when you have a belief which is true, but you also have good reasoning for why you thought it was true, right? But by definition, if we don't often know what truth is, or at least we can't know it with like absolute certainty, then we don't often know exactly which of our beliefs are knowledge and which aren't, right? So the thing that we can really talk about and control here are the beliefs themselves. Like, what are the beliefs that are reasonable for us to have? And how do we build a coherent web given all the information that we have, given the fact that we can't do all the experiments that have ever been done and we can't do all the thought experiments or we can't do everything. We have to kind of trust other people. What's a reasonable way to build a web of beliefs? Um, Given the fact that we don't always know what is true and maybe we'll never really know with any absolute certainty what is true. So that's what this book is about, and it's very pragmatic in the sense that it's trying to give us a reasonable roadmap to use to build our web and revise our web as new information comes in. How do we build reasonable hypotheses and test them? And so it's very pragmatic in that sense. It's not trying to give us like some absolute metaphysical truths about like this is what how beliefs come into be. This is, how you find absolute truth. It's not going to try to do that. Which is very common in philosophy. Instead, it's pragmatic, trying to give us a prescription, a way of living that produces a healthy web, if you will. Um, Reading this though, it feels a lot like just the established orthodoxy of philosophy of science. Like when I'm reading this book, oftentimes it feels like preaching to the choir. That being said, it's very well written, so it's very like it's worth reading because it's so clear in communicating that. But a lot of times it does feel like the established orthodoxy of philosophy of science, which is not a bad thing. But so if you want to, rethink about philosophy of science and where these ideas come from, I think Web of Belief is a good place to start and kind of think about that quite a bit. And probably my favorite chapter is a chapter entitled Hypotheses. So often in science, we have to come up with a hypothesis to try to explain the data that we have, and we only have so much data, so there's could be multiple hypotheses that fit the data. And this is also true in real life, right? When we pay attention to our government and politics and what's going on in our society, there's we pick up a lot of different data, but then there are many different hypotheses that we can put on the data that fits. So how do we decide which one is the right hypothesis, right? And when we listen to podcasts and the news and read the newspaper, whatever, we get many different hypotheses of what fits the data of our society or the problems that we have and things like that. So how do we decide which hypotheses are the most reasonable and which ones we should incorporate into our web of beliefs? So chapter 6 gives us um, a bunch of different tools to use to determine which of our hypotheses are reasonable. They call these virtues of hypotheses, which is great. I think a great name for it. And so there are 5 of them, but then there's a 6th one that comes in a later chapter. So I'll just name them for a second. There's conservatism. So conservatism is about, like, you change your web when you get new information, but you change it as little as possible, or you don't want to make, even though you could revise your web in like a huge way in order to fit the new data, you try to revise it as little as possible when you get new evidence. That's conservatism. 2 is modesty. 3 is simplicity. So oftentimes you can have like a really complicated hypothesis, or you can have a much simpler hypothesis, and we favor simplicity. Number 4 is generality. We want a hypothesis that can fit a lot of different physical phenomena or a lot of different beliefs about the world. 5 is refutability, meaning that when we have a hypothesis, there is some thought experiment we could do which could show that the hypothesis is incorrect, right? We want to make sure that our hypotheses are refutable. And then the 6th virtue, which comes up in a later chapter, is precision. And here, I'm not going to go into a really deep discussion of all these different virtues, though I encourage you to read this book, in particular that chapter. But I just want to point out one interesting thing about these virtues is that they are all in tension with each other. So instead of this list being like something where you try to maximize all 6 of them, you can't, because they are in tension with each other. So, for instance, a good example is simplicity and generality, and precision, right? So, these are in tension because the more general you make a hypothesis, meaning you can fit, like, for instance, if you can fit like general relativity and quantum mechanics together, you make things really general, then oftentimes the theory has to become less simple. And sometimes when you make things more simple, you might make them less precise and less general, right? So just those 3 in particular are in tension with each other. And all 6 of these virtues are in tension with each other. And so I see that tension in the virtues, though, as sharpening up our hypothesis. So as we try to sort of maximize the sum of these virtues in some sense, then we get a more satisfying hypothesis. And it's that tension which is sort of this pragmatic push towards making good hypotheses, which then form a very healthy web of belief. So I really like this idea of the tension between these virtues that guide us as we move forward and make different hypotheses about the world. Um, so yeah, I really like this book. I think it's really good. I think it's worth reading. Very readable. Again, a lot of times it feels like a philosophy of science book, which is great. If just as alone as a philosophy of science book, this is a great book. But the authors also clearly want this to be more than just a philosophy of science book. They want it to be a book about beliefs in general. And so I wish at times that they spent more time with examples about just everyday beliefs, like about politics, about our society, about history. And maybe not less time on the science beliefs because I think those are good examples, but just I almost wish there was like 50 to 100 more pages just discussing everyday beliefs because I think where this becomes the most interesting, but also the most thorny, is when we talk about just the beliefs that we have on an everyday basis. And again, they do talk about this, so I don't want to make it sound like they don't talk about that, but I feel like they could have spent a lot more time talking about that. And that is sort of the most interesting application of a lot of these things. You know, how well does this work? One more comment I'll make is that these authors are not claiming that this is how we necessarily come to make our beliefs on an everyday basis. I think they're well aware of the fact that, like, psychologically and sociologically speaking, there are many ways that humans are not rational. So instead, this is more a book describing how we should be rational and how we should come to our beliefs. But they do acknowledge that, luckily, um, evolution seems to have, to some degree, picked us to be fairly rational. Uh, of course, in the details, we are quite irrational as well. But what we're not like so irrational, evolutionary speaking, that we can't, in the author's minds and in my mind, kind of come to this place where we can form a reasonable web of belief. Of course, you can disagree about that, but I think that's certainly where the authors are coming from, that we can describe and perhaps even live with this sort of reasonable, rational way of constructing a web of belief. The ending, I will say, feels a bit abrupt. I was a little surprised by how abrupt the ending was. It does feel like it could have used another 50 to 100 pages or so. But it's well written and keeps you thinking and wanting to think about more. So I think that's good. So check it out. Let me know what you think. Like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope to see you at another video discussion.